Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to the first video of week number 5 of our course, Principles of Interface Design. This week, let's start off by looking at Universal Design for Learning, also known as UDL, and let's consider the implications for designing an interface. In this week's videos, let's take a look at Universal Design for Learning, and then in our second video, let's take a look at how you can create and also design a screencast. Before we consider universal design as applied to learning, let's first start by looking at universal design. Where did this come from and when did it start? Well, we find that universal design has its roots in law in this country. And we find that it was practiced heavily in the area of architecture. In Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, it was mandated that all public buildings be accessible to all people who might come into that building. Borrowing from the field of architecture, here's a quote from a kitchen and bath designer. And here she's saying that universal design is not focused on either the tall or the short person, a person who uses a wheelchair, or someone who has arthritis, a young or an older person. It's not focusing on certain types of people, but rather it embraces all of these possible users of a space or of a product, and it eliminates bias against them. So, in other words, the bottom line here is that the design needs of the users, whatever those unique needs are, will ideally be met by a robust design. And that, in essence, is what universal design is all about. Universal design doesn't say to retrofit or fix something after the fact in order to accommodate people with any type of unique needs. Rather than retrofitting and doing something after the fact, ideally construct the building right up front to meet the needs of all of the users who could possibly come into that space. And then universal design will become a way of life and it will benefit all people. So don't add a ramp after the fact for all of those steps in that building. Instead, build it without all of those steps, and that will accommodate more people. That's the essence of universal design. Many aspects of universal design actually began as a focus on particular types of users for a building. But then as time went on, and people started to see this design that would actually accommodate many different types of people, it became part of the mainstream, and we all expect to see these things in today's world. For example, automatic opening doors. Certainly we can understand that people who are coming in with physical disabilities would need to use doors that they don't have to stop and physically pull open, but rather they can press a button and it will automatically open for them. In today's world, a lot of people use those doors even though they don't have a physical disability. For example, if you're walking with a lot of books, or if you're coming in with like a baby carriage or some other types of heavy materials, you may rely on those automatic opening doors to help you. The curb cuts in sidewalks, those little ramps that we see, again, you could figure that those started to help people who are in wheelchairs or had other types of mobility issues. But in today's world, a lot of people use those because it's part of the universal design. It helps everybody. I like to do a lot of biking in the summer. If I'm going up on a sidewalk, rather than jumping the sidewalk as some young people do, I'll go up on those little ramps. If you're carrying any types of materials, again, baby carriages, if you have a wheelie cart and you're transporting books and so on into school, you can use those too. It's not just for people with different disabilities. We look at closed captions on TVs. And there are a lot of people, while we configure it, started to help people who were experiencing issues of hearing. So they had hearing impairments. But when we look at it, a lot of us are hearing impaired in different places. For example, if we're in a gym or an airport and the TVs are on and we can't hear them because there's just too many people and too much activity going on. So closed captions are turned on, and many people can benefit. Again, it's part of the universal design. It's just part of the mainstream, and we can all benefit from the use of these products. One more example, text messaging on cell phones. It was a number of years ago now. It was during President Clinton's administration and in the United States. And his administration said, we would like to make cell phones, they're not landlines, but cell phones, all cell phones to be sold in the country need to be accessible and usable by people who have different disabilities, especially in terms of hearing disabilities. Well, that's a tall order if you think about it. How are you going to make a phone that is primarily something you listen to and you talk into? How can you make that usable by someone who either cannot speak and or cannot hear? Well, text messaging was the answer. Now, in today's world, a lot of people assume, especially the young people today, assume, well, that's made for all of us. No, it wasn't originally designed for everybody. It was designed for people with hearing and speech issues so that they could use a cell phone. But look at that. That is, to me, is one of the best examples of universal design. Today, we all use it, and not only use it, but we expect it to be there. So you are participating in universal design all the time. Having introduced the concept of universal design, now let's focus on universal design for learning, also known as UDL. Now certainly, on one level, UDL refers to having physical access to school buildings. So in educational facilities, because most of our schools are public facilities, we definitely want to and have to by law allow physical access to any user who could come into our building. But UDL, the majority of UDL actually goes into a whole other area, and that is access to the curriculum, the teaching, the learning, the assessment part of the school building. So universal design has a lot of implications for what teachers do, and in turn for what designers, any kind of educational designer of any kinds of materials of any sort in any medium, there are a lot of implications for us. Let's take a better look at that. So how can we define universal design for learning? We could define it as a set of principles for curriculum development that provides all individuals in our classrooms equal opportunities to learn. So what does the universal in universal design for learning mean? Well, it gives us a blueprint for creating everything that we do in the classroom. For example, creating instructional goals, the methods of teaching that we utilize, the materials that we create for student use, regardless of the medium that we use, and even the assessments. So we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all, and we already referred to that when we're looking at the quote from the kitchen and bath planner in the area of architecture. So it's not one-size-fits-all, but rather it's a flexible approach that allows us to adjust for the needs of all the users, or in our case, in the classroom and learning of all the students who come into the classroom. You'll notice that I have given credit to the CAST organization when we were looking at UDL and when we were looking at defining it and describing it. So what is the CAST organization? Well, CAST refers to the Center for Applied Special Technology. This is an organization that started in 1984, and In the early 1980s, that's when personal computers were developed, and by 1984-ish, they started to come into the mainstream, and they became more available to be purchased by the average consumer. And families started to buy them. Certainly, we started to see them in offices and in different businesses. So the CAST organization started at that time, and they started with the desire to explore ways of capitalizing on these new technologies and discovering how to provide better educational experiences for students with different disabilities. As CAST grew and as they developed their vision over about a decade, the organization came to a new understanding of how to improve education using flexible methods, flexible materials, and they called that approach universal design for learning. And CAST has been active and still is growing, and they have tremendous resources available today for educators, parents, and students. Today, UDL frames the CAST organization's research and development, including their work with curriculum planning. They've developed software. They influence state and national policies, teacher preparation, and also educational research that concludes with UDL-based solutions to use in the classroom. So we're going to take a look at and rely heavily on a lot of the materials and research that was developed by the CAST organization. So who benefits from UDL in our classroom? Certainly folks with differences, physical differences, sensory differences, cognitive differences, learning differences, really cultural differences, language difference. Everybody can benefit from UDL, because keep in mind, it's not one solution, it's one robust series of solutions that everyone can tap into and benefit from. Where I get excited about UDL is the fact that as technology has grown and continues to grow, digital multimedia learning tools make UDL a very reachable goal. And through the use and proper design of these technological tools for learning, we can really help out our students, and we can achieve the aims of UDL in our classroom to make our classroom a very accessible place where everybody can have equal access to our educational materials and to learning. You're looking at the current way, the most recent way that CAST expresses the guidelines for universal design in learning. This is a very involved and I think an excellent representation of this content. Let's start taking a look at this content, and it certainly deserves more attention than what we're going to spend on it right now, but let's attempt to unpack it at least a little bit. Because realize CAST has been in existence since the early 1980s. This does represent the wealth of wisdom and research that they have built up for all those years. So we look at the very top. Here we can see three main guidelines, which provide multiple means of engagement, and they're talking about the why of learning. The second major guideline is present multiple means of representation, or the what of learning. And finally, the third guideline is provide multiple means of action and expression, the how of learning. So we looked across the top. Now let's go down to the bottom. The bottom represents the goal of each of those three guidelines. Expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, so that all refers to this first guideline. Expert learners who are resourceful and knowledgeable, and that is the culmination of this guideline. And finally, learners who are strategic and goal-directed. And that's the goal of this third guideline. Now, another dimension that's built into this model is listed over here. The first tab is indicating access, so that refers to this row. And then building, that's over here. And then the third row is internalization, and that's down here. So notice that as you travel down the model in each of the columns, it starts off with more external, like accessing, and then building. That's starting to move more into the internal. And finally, until the learner, we take a look at how to internalize these elements. So as you can see from this very brief overview of this excellent graphic, there's a whole lot in here. Let's attempt to unpack this just a little bit more. Let's go to the CAST website and view some of the helpful materials that are out there. So I'm going to do that for two purposes. Number one, to help unpack this graphic more, but number two, to introduce you to the materials that are available on the CAST website, because it is certainly worth spending more time there as an educator. On the website, udlguidelines.cast.org, you can find this information. And you notice across the top, here's engagement, here's representation, and here's action and expression. Now, before we actually get into these three, as these were columns in the chart that we just looked at, look over here. In terms of interface design, look at this aid over here for navigation. How nice is this? You've seen the chart. You remember that there were rows and columns. This dot now indicates where we're located here. And if we were to click on one of these other areas here, and we can also scroll down the page, click on one of those areas, you can see where you're positioned within this interface, within this website. That's an excellent bit of design there. So having said that, let's take a look at each of these areas very briefly. And again, I'm going to introduce you to this because it's worth spending much more time here. We talked about engagement, representation, and action and expression. So when we're talking about engagement, what's it all about? Well, as Robert Gagne indicated in his 9 significant steps or 9 significant events model of teaching, he said you have to gain the attention of the learner first. In other words, learners have to be engaged or motivated to learn. And as teachers, we know that learners are motivated in many, many different ways. There's not one means of engagement that's going to be optimal for all the learners. So universal design says, let's provide multiple options for engagement, and it's essential before learning takes place. If the learners are not motivated, if they're not engaged, no hope for learning to happen. As we scroll down here, we can see some main points. To recruit interest, we spark excitement. Well, how do we do that? Well, then some points over here. Again, you can see there's an arrow here, good design, talking about different checkpoints, what you can do to help achieve this. Learners learn best when they have some choice, when they have autonomy somewhat over their learning. You want the learning to be relevant and have value to them and to be perceived as authentic and important. And of course, we also want to make sure that the classroom is free of any threats. We want it to be a safe place. So in a similar fashion, you could see 2 other areas that could help in the area of engagement. And remember, on the chart, as you travel down the chart, we start to move from the external to the more internal aspects as students start to internalize this, and it can then change their lives and their learning for the future. So you can see some ideas here of how we can promote that piece and ultimately moving to the area of self-regulation, where the student says, okay, I can develop some of this myself. I can do self-assessment. I can reflect on my own learning. So, and that leads to the goal that we saw in the chart. So there's engagement. If we move quickly to representation, we know that learners differ tremendously in the way that they perceive and comprehend information. So we, as teachers, we can't just provide one way of representing content to the learners, because not one means of representation will be optimal for all the learners. And again, UDL says let's make it robust solution and let's provide multiple ways of doing this. So how can we do this? Well, let's look as we scroll down about ideas about perception. How can we help students perceive it differently? So we're looking at alternatives for audio, alternatives for video, for visual information. We talk about language and symbols and practical guidelines and guidance in terms of clarifying vocabulary, make sure everybody can understand the symbols that are used and decode them, and make sure that people with different languages can understand. And a good idea is to illustrate through different types of media. And then another area here is comprehension. Again, as we're moving down the chart, we're getting more into the internalization of these points. And you can see various items here where we ultimately can help students maximize the generalization or the transfer of learning from this situation to others. So let's move quickly to the third and final area, which is provide multiple means of action and expression. So what are we talking about here? Well, we know that learners have a variety of ways in which they can express what they know. So once a learner acquires new information, new content, then we want them to practice that, and we want them to then express that content back out as part of the learning. Because learners are so different, there's not one means of action to interact with the content and ways of expressing the content that are optimal for all the learners. So once again, UDL says create a robust solution with options for action and for expression, and that's essential. So on this part of the chart, we learn about physical action, how students can interact physically with content, how they can communicate and express their understanding of that content. And then again, as we move down the chart, we're looking more at the internalization. So how can students, how can they develop themselves? How can they manage information? How can they enhance their own capacity and monitor their own progress so that this can transfer into their lives as they internalize it? So as you can see, just a very quick view here, an overview of all of this material. There's a whole lot to unpack here. Again, I recommend taking a better look at this website by CAST, and it's at udlguidelines.cast.org, and that will give you the option to view the unpacking of that model in much more detail. Let's do one more take and summarize this content, because there is so much to unpack and understand and digest here. UDL guidelines. There are three. Number one, provide multiple means of engagement. So we talk about engagement. We say learners are each motivated differently. Draw them into the content in different ways. Number two, multiple means of representation. Learners differ in so many ways in which they acquire content and as they learn. So because of that, we vary the ways that we present material to the students. And the third UDL guideline is to provide multiple means of action and expression. We know that learners differ greatly in how they express content, so let them interact with the content and let them express their understanding of the content with options. Let them choose from different a menu of options, and that would help many, many learners. So let's take this and unpack it one more level. I'm going to draw from the help file from a wonderful software app that was created by the CAST organization. It's called UDL Studio, and we'll take a look at that. But I like the way this information is presented, and it's very helpful to designers of interfaces. So let's start with text. So CAST says, when you're deciding on text, make sure you can answer yes to at least one or more of these following questions. So this is taken directly from that website. Is it interesting? Is it something that the audience can relate to? Will they understand it? What's the level of writing? Is it right for your audience? Is the right amount of text on each page as appropriate to the learners that you're going to deal with? Regarding animations, CAST suggests when you're selecting animations, make sure that they add meaning to your representation of the content as you're teaching it. Make sure that it does contribute to the reader's understanding, and it's not put there like a little extra, but it should really contribute in some way to the reader understanding that content. And maybe it can help the readers engage more and relate to that content. And also avoid animations that are either off point or they are distractors for some of your learners. Based on that premise, CAST suggests answering these questions when you're selecting animation for your interface. Is it enhancing student understanding of what they're reading? Is it another way of representing information that's important that you want them to understand? Does it enhance the reading? Is it appropriate for that particular audience? When you're selecting images to represent your content, first and foremost, avoid images that are distractors, ones that will kind of take your learners off of the topic and take them out on a mental tangent. And then CAST suggests answering questions like these. Does the text and the illustration complement? Do they complement each other? Is your image that you're using another way to represent the text? Because we found that CAST highly suggests multiple representations, different options. Do the images engage the audience? Is the audience going to be interested by this? And again, are they at the right level? Think about even the colors and because in this course we're looking at all different aspects of design, including the boldness of the colors and the feeling and the perceptions and the way people feel when they see these things. So can you answer yes to these types of questions? If you can, according to CAST, you're in the right direction. And finally, in the medium of video, just like the other media that we just considered, when you're choosing video, think about what it's going to add to your educational product. If it's an effective video, it should engage the audience well, and it should help their understanding of that content. And also, once again, avoid linking to some video that's going to be a distractor, something that's going to take them on a mental tangent off of the understanding the content. Given that, CAST suggests answering these questions. Is the video being used to enhance student understanding of the text? Is it another means of representing that same content? Because multiple means of representation is very good. Is the video at the right level for the audience who you will be presenting this content to? And also, does the video possibly enhance the reading experience of the text that's involved in your representation of the content? If so, if you can answer yes to several of these questions, CAST says you're on the right track for applying UDL in terms of video. A robust and well-researched organization, CAST provides access to a lot of free learning tools. As of the creation of this video, this is the current list of the tools that CAST provides. If you sign up for a free account, you can then log into this first listing of tools. You can learn about Universal Design for Learning. There's a book builder. There's a curriculum self-check. There's like a social media area where teachers can exchange information about how they're applying UDL. There's software called UDL Journal and one that I love called UDL Studio. And you don't have to log in for this next set of tools, the CAST Science Writer, learning about the different editions of UDL. There's a product called I Solve It. Those are math puzzles. And they also have a curriculum toolkit, which can be very helpful for teachers. So do check out the many resources that this organization provides if you want to learn more about UDL and if you want to make your material more accessible to all learners. In summary, we found that the CAST organization has created the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. We know that as UDL. And they've also created a plethora of very helpful resources. And these resources will support teachers as we attempt to make our educational delivery and also our educational materials accessible to all of our students. And as interface designers, we find that their work can positively support the work that we do as well.